This specific loop is what we're going to be tackling today. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about it, and instead, we're just going to start the tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to actually keep the default cube for once. We're going to click and drag from this junction over here to open a new window and change the type from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Over here, we're going to click new to add a new geometry node tree, and we're going to be playing around with this particular tree. Now the effect that I'm going to show with a cube, but you could use different geometries. I'll show you that later on. The first thing that we want is to distribute a bunch of points within the volume of this cube, and that can be done using the new nodes that have come out in Blender version 3.4 onwards. So let's press Shift A and search for a mesh to volume node, and you can just plug this over here. Now you can go ahead and search for a distribute points in volume node and place that right here. Now essentially you can control the density of the points to get more or less a number of points in the volume. For now, I'm going to keep the density at something low like 100, but while rendering, I'll probably render out at 1000 points. After that, I'm going to just bring these down and I'll search for an instance on points node so that we can actually convert these points to some real objects. For the real objects, I'm going to search for an icosphere and I'm going to place this mesh into the instance. But before doing that, I'm going to change the radius down to something like 0.01 meters and then plug that into the instance. Now this seems all right. However, we require particles to be deleted based on some texture. So to do that, we're going to search for a delete geometry node and we're going to place that right here, and we're going to change it from point to instance such that certain instances are deleted. So now we can search for whatever texture you want to use. In my case, I'm going to be using a Voronoi texture, but you could definitely use a noise texture or a Musgrave texture or anything of your choosing. Now, before plugging the distance into the selection, I'm going to actually search for a color ramp so that we have more control, and plug the distance into the factor of the color ramp and plug the color of the color ramp into the selection of the delete geometry node. Now I'm going to go ahead and just start bringing the black in till we see certain particles being present. Now I can go ahead and just increase the scale or decrease it till we actually see it clump. So we're seeing that it starts clumping when it's at fairly small values. So I'll go to a scale of something like 1 and you should be able to see the clumping. When you actually increase the density over here to something like 1000, the clumping will become even more prominent. And this is the type of effect that we actually want. Now in this case, you see the clumping is actually particles in spherical shapes and the voids present in between them. However, I want the areas to be deleted as spherical voids. So what I'll do is I'll just take this color ramp and flip it. And that way, the areas that are being deleted in slightly spherical shapes. I think if we increase the density even further, it'll be even more clear. So let's just make it 5000. And here you can see the cavities that are being formed are spherical. So that's what I personally like, or is my preference for the effect that I'm going for today. So I'll keep it like this and I'll reduce the density back to 100 just so that it's faster on my viewport for now. The next thing is that we actually want this Voronoi texture to keep changing dynamically and looping. So to do that, we're going to take the Voronoi texture, we'll press Shift D to duplicate it and add one down here, and we're going to change both of these from 3D to 4D, and we'll have to do the same thing for this one as well. Now, when you actually change it to 4D, the scale might seem to slightly change, so just check the density once again. So I think it's all right. So what I'll do is I will search for a mix node and I'll change the type from float to color, and I'll just plug it in after the first Voronoi texture before the color ramp. And then I'll plug the distance from the second Voronoi texture into the second socket over here. Now the W's are what we're going to be animating. So the one on top, I want it to go from 0 to -1. And the one at the bottom is going to go from 1 to 0. Essentially, wherever this particular one starts, the one on top starts, the second one should end at that particular value. So let's go to frame 0 on our timeline and change W and hit I while hovering over W on the Voronoi texture. And then we'll go to frame 300 because I want this to be a 10-second long animation. So I'll go to the frame 300, click there and change W to -1 and then press I. Now the thing is that by default it's going to be Bezier, so we have to actually select the node to see the keyframes here, press T and change the interpolation to linear. Now we can go to the Voronoi texture at the bottom. So now with the second Voronoi texture selected, because we're already at the last frame and we want it to end at 0, we're going to press I, and then we're going to go back to the first frame and then change the W value to something like 1 and then press I. while hovering over W. So once we've done that, again, select the node, press T, linear. So now the last thing that we have to do is play around with this mix value. So initially it should be only the first Voronoi texture. So we're going to have to change the factor all the way to 0 and then press I while hovering over it. Then we can go all the way to frame 300 and change the factor all the way to 1 and press I while hovering over it. Now remember, we have to select the node again, then press T, linear. So now the Voronoi texture should be looping, and you can just check that by playing the animation. The frame rate does drop quite a bit, so if you want, you can change the playback from play every frame to frame dropping, and you should be able to see what it looks like. Towards the end, you can see that the loop is perfect, and that's what we want. So now in the geometry node itself, we want the actual box or cube that was covering this to also be seen. So for that, we're going to search for a join geometry node, and we're just going to plug that right before the group output. And then we're going to take the geometry from the input and plug that right in before the join geometry. Now you see a bunch of the points are actually coming outside the cube, and that's simply because in our mesh to volume node, you see we have an exterior bandwidth and that's set to 0.1. So we're going to change that to 0. And in fact, to make sure that it doesn't get too close to the sides of this particular object, we're going to increase the interior bandwidth to 0.1 meter. That way, nothing will come and touch the sides of this cube. Now we want different materials to be added to the cube and to the particles. So we're going to have to search for a set material node and plug that in these different places. So search for the set material and plug that in over here, and then search for another set material node and plug that in over here. Now we need two different materials, so we can go to the materials tab over here, and we already have a default material. We'll call this outer cube, and we can press this plus button to add in a new slot, and then press new and change this to particles. Now for the cube, we can just select outer cube, and for the particles, we can just select the particles material. Now the cube would look much better if it actually has a little bit of bevel, but sadly you can't do that in geometry nodes yet. There is no bevel node. So in order to actually get it to bevel, what we'll do is we'll search for a subdivision mesh node and plug that in here and just increase the levels to something like 5. You can actually see the levels by changing it to wireframe view up here, and this is the density of the wireframe that we have. Maybe we can change the level down to 4 because we'll be adding in a subdivision surface node after that. So now search for a subdivision surface node and just plug that in over here and change the levels to 2. That way you get this really dense mesh and the edges are nicely beveled as well. Alternatively, you could have the subdivide mesh down to 3 and the subdivision surface level up to 3, and that actually increases the bevel amount. So maybe we'll use this for now. Now we actually have to go ahead and play around with the materials and things like that. So what I'll do is I will change this window from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. And I also realized I didn't switch on screencast keys, so I'll just switch that on now. Sorry for that, but hopefully everything was explained and you didn't need to see what I was doing. So now for the particles, to actually see what we're doing, I'll set all of my render defaults. So I'll go to render properties, switch on bloom and switch on screen space reflections. And underneath screen space reflections, I'll also switch on refraction. I'll change the viewport shading to rendered so that we can see what we're doing. And also before I start the shading, I can clearly see the subdivisions and I don't want that. So I'll go back to my geometry node editor and I will just search for a set shade smooth node and plug that in after the subdivision surface modifier. Once we're done with that, we can go back to the shader editor and start off with the actual shading. Before the particles, we'll deal with the outer cube. So we'll go to the material properties here and select outer cube from up here. And then we'll use a material very similar to the material used in this tutorial that you can see in the top right corner right now. So for that, we're going to have to delete the principal BSDF, search for a glass BSDF and a transparent BSDF. And to mix these two together, we're going to search for a mix shader node and just plug that in. I have the transparent in the top shader and the glass in the bottom socket, because whichever area is black in the texture, we want it to be transparent. So we can plug the shader value into the surface. And to actually control the factor, we're going to search for a layer weight node and we're going to pass that through a color ramp for extra control. So we're going to add in the color ramp and plug the facing value into the factor and the color value from the color ramp into the factor of the mix shader. However, you'll notice that you won't be able to see through this and actually see the particles. And that's because in our settings down here, you have to change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. Then we're going to have to decheck show backface, and we're going to have to check screen space refractions. So that way, now you'll be able to actually see the particles inside. The next thing that we actually have to do is change the shadow mode from opaque to none, because we don't want the shadow later on. And this is what we currently have. Now you see the regions which are facing straight on, we can see the dots properly, and towards the edges and things like that, there's quite a bit of refraction happening. However, I want a little bit more of the particles to be seen, and that's why we're just going to bring in the black of the color ramp a little bit by clicking and dragging, and that way more particles will be seen without any refraction. So I think something like that seems all right. So there's still quite a lot of refraction happening down here and here, but a lot more of the particles in the center are actually seen. So that's all right for my outer cube material. Now I'm going to have to deal with the actual particles. So I'm going to switch over to particles by selecting it from the material properties over here. And for these, I can just remove the principal BSDF and search for an emission node. And I'm going to plug the emission into the surface and increase the strength to something like 5 or 10. For now, we'll start off with 5. What we have to do to get nice variation of colors can actually be done in many ways, but I'm going to use a method that I haven't used before on this channel. I'm just going to search for a texture coordinate node, and I'm going to take the object value and plug that into a color ramp. So I have to search for the color ramp, place it there, and plug the object into the factor. And for the object, instead of actually letting it just be the particles, I'm going to press Shift A and search for an empty plane axis, and I'll just scale it up a little bit so that it can be seen easily. Then I'm going to select my geometry node object again and choose the empty from the drop-down list for the texture coordinates. Now, if I plug this color into the emission, you can actually see how the object's position is causing some of them to be black and some of them to be white. But that's because our color ramp is black and white. So we want a few more colors to be added in. So let's just press the plus button twice to add in 2 new markers. And now the first one, I'm just going to change it to a bright blue color like this. The second marker, I'm going to change 90 degrees to the left and make this lemon green color. This one is going to go 90 degrees further down, so it's going to be red. And this last one can be 90 degrees changed to that, so this purple color over here. So that's what the colors currently look like. And we can't quite see any of them. So we're going to take the empty, and now we can just move the empty around till we get all the colors the way we want it to be. So clearly the empty was scaled up, so it's actually taking so much of space for the blue, so much of space for the yellow and the red and purple and things like that. So what we can actually do is just bring the empty down here and then scale the empty down, and the textures also scale in, and we get all of those different colors placed in. Now we can just move the empty to a position that we like, where all the colors are present, and I think this is the setting that I'm going to go with. So now that I have this particular setting set up, I'm going to go ahead and just increase the strength of the emission a little bit more. So I'll make it 10 so that we get some more bloom. And I also don't want them to be this saturated. So I'm going to search for a hue saturation node, plug that in here, and just decrease the saturation to something like 0.95. So these are the particles that I have. And now I can go ahead and start off with the actual animation. So for the animation, I don't want the cube to just be sitting on a plane like this. I want it to be rotated at a 45 degrees angle. So I'm going to go to the object properties over here and change the rotation to 45 on all of the angles or all of the axes. So I can just press Shift, click and drag to bring it down to all of them, and then press 45 degrees and we are set. The next thing is I want this to actually be resting on the base plane. However, I can just bring the base plane down. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to press Shift A and search for a plane, scale the plane up quite a bit, and then grab it on the Z and just bring it down. Next, I'm going to press Shift A and just search for an empty, which is going to be my camera controller. So for that, I will search for arrows just to differentiate it from the plane axis that we used before. And now we can take our camera, press 0 to go into our camera view, and come to an area that we actually like. So I think I'm going to change the view transform orientation from global to local. And that way I can just say GZ and it's going to actually zoom in and out. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on my cube. So something like that is all right. And then I'm going to press Shift and select my empty that I added in and press Ctrl P, set parent to object. So now I can actually just move the empty around by rotating it on the Z, and that's what's going to help me rotate around my cube. So that is one method of doing this animation. So for now, I'll just place it over here and let it be for the time being. What I need to do now is figure out how the background is going to be and things like that. So I'll go to the world properties and change the color of the background down to black or something very, very dark. And then I'm going to select my plane and press new to add in a new material. And I'm just going to make it very much metallic and just reduce the roughness quite a bit. Ideally, that'll create nice reflections from the particles. But right now that's far too low for the reflections to be seen. So I'm going to press GZ and grab it up till it just comes to the cube. And now you'll be able to see a little bit of reflections, which will be really nice. After that, the actual light, I don't know if I actually need it. So if I hide the light, this is what we have. And that might be all right, but I'll have to take a call on that in a while. For now, I'll just keep it in. Now I'll take the empty 001, go to frame number 0 on my timeline, and then press I, location, rotation, and scale, or just a rotation would have been enough. Now I'm going to go to frame 300 and then say RZ360, I, rotation. In this case, rotation, and scale also is fine. Now I'm going to press T, linear, just so that it's a perfectly looping animation. And now you can press the spacebar to actually see the animation a little bit. Another thing that I'm not liking is the actual edges of this cube. So I'm going to select it, press Ctrl 5 to add in a subdivision surface of level 5, and that just makes it a nice sphere in a sense. So I think that's what I'm going to keep. And I'm just going to change the background to be slightly, no, I'll keep the background fairly dark. I'll take my camera after that, just select it by choosing the edges over here, go down to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1, and then switch overlays back off. And then you can see what the animation currently looks like. So I don't want the light to actually cause this particular reflection. And I also have shadows from the actual particles being seen. So I'm going to again select the cube, go to the settings of the materials and choose particles, go down, change the shadow mode to none. After that, I'm going to select the light and actually switch it off for now because it doesn't seem to be doing too much. So that's about it for the animation. There's a few other things that you could do if you wanted to, like add in maybe some extra rings. So let's press Shift A, curve, circle, and just scale that up. Then you can go down to the curve properties over here, increase the resolution to something like 64 to make it nice and smooth. Under the geometry bevel, you have to increase the depth just so that it has some thickness. Then you can add in a new material. Press X to delete the principled BSDF, search for an emission node, plug that into the surface. Then press Shift A, search for a gradient texture, and search for a color ramp. Now you want the gradient to be linear, but you want it to go from one point all the way around. So for that, we're going to have to use the UV coordinates. So press Ctrl T with the node wrangler switched on to get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Switch it over to UV, and then you can plug the color into the emission and you'll be able to see it go from black to white. So you can see the black is starting right over there. So just add in 2 more points if you want. And now change this black to maybe red. We'll go for an RGB look. So just make this red. And we're going to make this one red as well so that it perfectly matches. And we don't get a seam at this edge. Now this one, we're going to change it to green. And this one, we're going to change to blue so that we get RGB. And then we can increase the strength to something like 5, switch this off. And yeah, that's just some add-ons that you could add in. If you feel like it's a bit too strong, again, search for a layer weight node, search for a math node, and we're going to have to set it from add to multiply. Plug the Fresnel into the value, change the value to something like 10, and then plug this into the strength. And that way, the middle area is actually going to remain black. And you can just zoom in and see what it looks like. And we require some more control. So we're going to search for a color ramp, plug that in over here, and then you can bring the black in, and yeah, that's what you get. So now increase the value, maybe 100, and there. That's one method of creating this. We'll also reduce the hue saturation. So just search for a hue saturation node, reduce the saturation to 0.95, and that's about it for the animation. If you want to change the shape of this, as I said, I would show you, you can change back to the geometry node editor. And here for the group input, instead of using the cube, we can just press Shift A and search for whatever shape you want, UV sphere, and honestly, you could use Suzanne or any other mesh that you've already created, and then just plug this mesh right here. And again, because you're actually subdividing the mesh quite a bit, make sure you reduce the segments to maybe 16, just so that it's easier for your laptop to handle. You can reduce the rings also to 8. After that, increase the radius to 2, and we have to plug this into the mesh to volume as well. So that way we get like a sphere doing the exact same thing. And yeah, that's just different things that you could do. However, I'm going to go ahead and use the cube itself. A few changes just before rendering. The first thing is the glass shader. I'm just going to change it and give it a little bit of a bluish hue. And that way, when it's actually refracting towards the end, you get a little bit of color that seems all nicer in my opinion. The next thing is that I forgot to tell you to change the frame rate to 30 frames per second and the output folder to wherever you want it to be stored. File format, we're going to use FFmpeg video with an encoding set from Matroska to MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. So beyond that, for the floor as well, I'm actually going to just expand it to infinity and maybe just search for a noise texture to go into the roughness through a color ramp, of course. And I'm going to play around with the scale and use that as the floor instead. So those are just a few changes that I'll be making, and then I'm going to be rendering. So hopefully you learned something in this particular video and you can create really cool animations using this particular method. I am currently posting videos every single day, so you can be sure that something or the other is going to keep coming out. So to help not miss anything, be sure to subscribe and comment what you want to see next, and we'll definitely create a video on that. So until your suggestions come up, don't forget to stay creative.